Hello everyone, welcome to chapter 3, parts 1 and 2 of Lenin's State and Revolution. So that this doesn't take 2 hours, so that this isn't like a 2-hour long video, I'm going to break chapter 3 up into a couple parts. There's 5 parts in total, and we'll just cover the first 2. Because I just don't want these videos to be super long, and it ended up taking me like 6 hours to take notes on these on this one chapter. So we'll cover 1 and 2. Chapter 3 is called Experience of the Paris Commune of 1871 and Marx's Analysis. So the Paris Commune is this Workers Uprising in Paris that happens, and Marx is going to analyze it really thoroughly. It means a lot to him and Lenin because they see it as a workers' movement that happens in real life that they can study and draw conclusions from for how socialism will come about. So part 1 is called, In What Does the Heroism of the Communards Exist? So Marx told the workers in Paris at first that overthrowing the state wasn't going to work. So he's like, you guys, don't try this. It's not going to work right now. But after a battle between the state and the proletariat was forced by the state, Marx enthusiastically supported the workers defending themselves. So as the workers have their uprising, the state comes after them and tries to crush their uprising. And Marx says, well, now go for it, workers. Defend yourselves. The state's attacking you. Stopping you from creating an alternative economic system to capitalism. Take up arms and defend yourself. So Lenin says at the time, a typical liberal Plekhanov said, I support the Paris Commune, but the workers should never have taken up arms. And that's the alternative view to Marx. And Marx said, no, the workers have the right to defend themselves. So Marx was less enthusiastic about the heroism of the workers' movement, which ultimately failed. And he was more concerned with what could be learned from what Lenin calls a historic experiment of gigantic importance and advancement in the world proletarian movement. And it teaches practical steps for workers more useful than a million discussions, right? So we can sit around and have book talks all we want. I love to have book talks, but actually doing something teaches us more than anything what we need to learn. So you can learn from the mistakes and also what went right. And they're doing this with just the Paris Commune, right? They're looking at just the Paris Commune. And today, there's a bajillion different socialist experiments we can look back on and see where they went right and see where they went wrong. How did the Soviet Union develop this bureaucracy that ultimately collapsed? What's China doing that allows capitalism to grow too much, and what are they doing right to establish socialism? Stuff like that. Look at these workers' movements and be critical of them, but also understand what they did right and use that to form our theories for how we can have socialist revolution at home, wherever you're watching this from, whatever country you happen to be living in. All right, so let me find my spot. I just kind of went on a ramble. So, Marx makes a correction or an update to the Communist Manifesto after the events of the Paris Commune. And he puts a new preface in 1972. And he says, the program of the Communist Manifesto is now in places out of date. So I'm going to read a line quick from page 33, where Lenin's quoting Marx here in State and Rev. He says, one thing especially, they continue, is proved by the Commune, that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. So Lenin says the vast majority of Marxists don't know that Marx changed his mind in this way, and people also distort this line to say that after the Commune, Marx wants a gradual revolution, right? They say, oh, here's Marx saying the workers can't just seize the state, right? It needs to happen gradually. And Lenin says, no, this is a misinterpretation. He's saying that the state must be seized and then shattered, right? They can't take hold of the ready-made state machinery. They need to take hold of it, completely abolish it as it currently exists, and create brand new institutions that represent the proletariat, the workers. So Lenin, to prove this, uses a passage from Marx where he's writing a letter to a guy named Kugelman. And he says, if you look at the last chapter of my 18th premiere, you will see that I declare the next attempt of the French Revolution must be, not as in the past, to transfer the bureaucratic and military machinery from one hand to the other, but to break it up. And this is the precondition of any real people's revolution on the continent. And this is what our heroic party comrades in Paris have attempted. So here Marx is clearly saying the state does not need to be just seized and used as it currently exists, but broken up and rebuilt as something new. And Lenin says that post-World War One, in England, there had been a state, or their capitalism had developed, but their state bureaucracy and military hadn't developed yet. So here, in a place like that, theoretically, workers wouldn't have needed to seize the state machinery because the state machinery didn't exist, right? And shout out to the libertarians who say monopolies only form through the government and don't think it's the monopolies who control the government. In England, monopolies developed without the government. But when those monopolies realized they needed to expand their capital overseas, a state apparatus emerged, a giant military. And Lenin says post-World War I, this imperialist war where all these major countries were fighting for the division of the spoils of their colonies, England, or after that, there's no longer this country without a giant state bureaucracy and a state military. They all developed it to fight, to maintain, and expand their capital during World War I. So every country now has a state bureaucracy which needs to be seized, shattered, and rebuilt as something new, and then eventually withered, which we'll talk about later. So Marx says the destruction of the military and bourgeois state is the precondition to any people's revolution. So just reiterating this idea. Lenin says the people's revolution, so he's going to define what people's revolution means, involves the masses, the majority in society who work rather than own, the people who have their labor exploited and want to change the system as a whole. So he brings up revolutions that happened in Turkey and Portugal, and he said these weren't revolutions from the masses. They didn't come from the mass of the people who are exploited, but the Russian Revolution of 1917 was. And Lenin says the revolution must include the proletariat and the peasants who have economic incentive to destroy the parasitic state and replace it with something new. The peasants and the proletariat, the two people who have their labor exploited the most. And we usually think of like Mao or Cuba as being more peasant revolutions, Mao's China or Fidel and Che in Cuba, because they turned the peasants against these huge giant plantation owners, right? The Cuban Revolution started with 22 people, but all they had to do was tell the peasants, hey, we're taking over the military dictatorship, the government at the time, the state, and we're going to replace it with something new, and also we're going to get rid of the plantation owners who have been working you like slaves. And Che's very clear that when you talk to these people, showing them any human compassion would get them on your side because they were so used to being exploited, right? And Lenin is saying this is where the revolution needs to come from, is these people who have their labor exploited, who have incentive to crush the state. The state does not help them. Everybody in America hates the government. They know it's parasitic. They have the incentive, the entire proletariat does, to crush the state and turn it into something new. And that's where this revolution needs to come from, right? That's who you need to reach, is the masses of people. Otherwise, your revolution's not going to work, or it's going to be a bourgeois revolution. You're just going to hand off the state machinery and the ownership to someone new. And like I said, China and Cuba was mostly peasants, but in Russia it was a lot of industrial workers and a lot of disaffected people who were tired of being sent to fight and die in World War I. And in the U.S., we have a unique situation, obviously, where we're sort of like this settler state, where we have an indigenous population. It's only 3% of the population, so it's not the same as a country like Bolivia, where 45% of their population's indigenous, and all the workers' unions, the trade unions, the people who have been most exploited by colonizers, run their labor unions are all indigenous, and people like Maduro and Evo Morales, Maduro in Venezuela and Chavez in Venezuela, and then people like Evo Morales and Luis Arce in Bolivia come from these indigenous working families. And in the U.S. it's only 3%, but those are still people who have been understand how exploitative and parasitic the state is, because the state, took all their land and put, and did extreme violence. But also, and of course you have the people who were brought over here on boats, but also you have to think that America's sort of a melting pot at this point, capitalism has developed here, and it's not exactly what it used to be, and there's nobody alive today who was brought here on a boat, but they still understand the exploitation of the state if they're workers, right? So the key in America is to unite these working masses of all races, based on the fact that they're all in the economic class that's exploited, one, by the parasitic government, the state, and two, the capitalists. We're seeing right now with the stock market trading that's going on, where people are buying stock from companies that are being shorted, and it's making these giant hedge funds lose millions of dollars, so they're just blocking poor people out of the market, right? We have to turn the masses, the poor people, the people who actually work hard in the system and produce everything we have around us, against the owning class. And there's different racial elements that are important to understand in the U.S. and certain colonial elements that are important to understand as well, but the key always lies in reaching the masses, I think, and turning the masses against the parasitic state and the parasitic bourgeoisie. All right. Oh, and I also wrote that we have an example of this in the U.S. when the white sharecroppers, who were being exploited by the Confederate plantation owners and also, of course, the slaves, teamed up to overthrow the plantation owners, and the Confederacy was the state apparatus protecting the plantation owners. And we were able to go from slavery into capitalism, which obviously capitalism is an improvement from slavery. And now we need to go from capitalism to socialism. All right. So now we're moving on to part 2. What is to replace the shattered state machinery? So Lenin says the manifesto gives critiques but not specifics about how the proletariat can organize themselves as the new ruling class. So it says you need to take over the state, but doesn't say here's what you build afterwards. Because Marx needed to see it attempted first. This is why, even though the Paris Commune was a meager and failed revolution, Marx painstakingly studied it and tried in France to answer this question of what needs to be rebuilt after the state is destroyed. And he writes about it in his book, The Civil War in France. He says, in France, the state transformed from absolute monarchy to centralized power with armed bodies that we recognize today. Military, police, the state bureaucracy, all this. As capitalism develops, the state becomes more an organ of the bourgeoisie, who use it to control the proles, to bust unions, but also to suppress proletarian movements in the global south, right? What happens every time a socialist leader takes power in Africa or Latin America? The U.S. and some European country team up to put it down, right? The CIA goes in, this armed body goes in and puts the proletarian movement down, maintains capitalism, stops the masses from saying, hey, the system exploits us, let's make another one. The state is a tool of the bourgeoisie to maintain the current system of capitalism and to keep the exploited people in their place. So that, we see this as union busting, blah, blah, blah. Covered all that. Moving on to my next page of notes here. So the Commune was the antithesis to empire, as it looked not only to destroy the oppressive state, but class society itself, which is the root of the state's parasitism and oppression. So if you take the state, the finance capitalists, the banks, and the industrial capitalists who are doing these wars overseas, and you say, stop sending the workers to war, your assets belong to us now, you can also stop the wars themselves. So this is seizing the problem at the root, which is why socialism is the antithesis to imperialism, and why the Paris Commune was the antithesis to imperialism. So Marx says the standing army must be replaced with the people's army. And the Mensheviks, the social democrats in Russia at the time, refused to do this. Excuse me, Lenin says in Revolutionary Russia. So they want to keep the army intact. And any successful revolution that's made it, so Mao's China, Fidel's Cuba, Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam, the Nicaraguan Sandinistas, they've done this. They've transformed the army into a people's army, the People's Liberation Army in China. And obviously in Cuba, they took power by guerrilla warfare against the plantation owners and the military dictatorship. So they crushed the state apparatus, the military as it currently exists, and they replace it with an army for the people, for the defense of the people, rather than for the exploitation of proletarian movements around the world and at home. So Marx says the Commune replaced the state bureaucracy with municipal councils chosen through universal suffrage, so meaning everybody votes. And they have these municipal councils, so these little councils, local councils, where workers can elect their own people who make decisions about government and about production, how production is carried out. So like decentralizing power and allowing people to make the most important decisions that affect their everyday lives. and they're voting representatives from their own class. So people who work, who they respect, who they trust to make these decisions, or who they're electing to these municipal councils. You see this in the Venezuelan communes today. Please Google the Venezuelan communes. They have these municipal councils who make production decisions, and then the Venezuelan state gives them food and gives them aid. And it's also to try and build socialist consciousness. And this is the kind of decentralized revolution that Venezuela's been, that the U.S. is trying to crush, because they do not want to see a system of popular democracy. They want to maintain dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. So in the Paris Commune, the police were stripped of their political functions. So today, police have the political function of keeping the prisons full, because the prison industrial complex makes a ton of money. Please watch the movie 13th. And it instead makes the police an agent of workers' councils. They're paid workmen's wages, and high dignitaries of the state are gotten rid of, right? So people like DAs, people like Kamala Harris, whose literal job is to communicate with the prison industrial complex and make sure the sentences are harsh enough and long enough, make sure enough people are in jail so the profits of the prison industrial complex are being filled. And then this is the kind of person who's then filtered into the state apparatus, who then becomes the vice president of the United States, right? These high dignitaries whose only job is to oppress the bourgeoisie. And these jobs are useless. They need to be completely gotten rid of. The Commune wanted to strip the state of its partisan and oppressive functions to implement real democracy, like you obviously can't have. The U.S. doesn't have. 93% of elections are decided by who raises the most money. Lobbying decides everything. All these wars are just decided upon without the vote of the people. It's not a democracy. They wanted to implement a real democracy where the workers are actually choosing what happens. So Lenin and Marx are using dialectics here. So we're going to do a quick dialectics lesson. So dialectics is the interpenetration of opposites. I'm doing a dialectics lesson because Lenin brings it up. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't. But Lenin thinks it's important, so we're going to do it. So it's the interpenetration of opposites. Oh, man, my light just shut off. Let's see if I can turn it back on. Oh, let there be light. All right, we're back. The interpenetration of opposites which bring about change. So the interpenetration of opposites they have going on here is the commune at one pole and the bourgeoisie at one pole. And in Paris, they're doing battle and they're fighting for supremacy, and their fight is going to bring about a new and different system. So dialectics is the transformation from quantity to quality from long struggle. So after long struggles, there comes about observable and definable changes, which is the qualitative change. So great example, the Civil War. So after this long struggle of the Civil War between the Union and the slaves and the exploited people at one hand, and the people who just wanted to implement capitalism, or, there were more radicals in there too, but them at one pole, and then the plantation owners and the Confederacy at the other pole. They had a struggle, and this side won out, and something new was created, the Confederacy. The state apparatus protecting the plantation owners was abolished, slavery was abolished, and a new kind of system came about, capitalism. Now, capitalism has developed racist institutions like the criminal justice system, which continues to prey on majority people of color, but we moved to a entirely different system than slavery, right? Slavery no longer exists in the sense that it did. This is a qualitatively different system that came about after a long struggle. And this is kind of the idea of dialectics, and now the struggle is between the proles and the bourgeoisie, and the system that comes out of that will be socialism. So actions over the course of time create new definitions and systems. The qualitative change in the commune was from capitalist democracy to proletarian democracy. So no longer this dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, that's democracy according to the capitalists, but true proletarian democracy where decisions are being made by the workers themselves. So after this qualitative change, the bourgeoisie must still be suppressed, Marx says. This is what's learned from the Paris Commune. And this is what the Paris Commune failed to do, leading to its downfall. So they transformed it qualitatively from a capitalist democracy to a proletarian democracy, but they didn't have enough institutions in place to protect themselves from the whip of counter-revolution, as Marx sometimes calls it. The bourgeoisie saying, hey, we don't want you creating a new system other than capitalism, and we have this state apparatus which we've made just to make sure capitalism is maintained, and they crush the proletarian democracy. Obviously, there's a bajillion examples of the CIA doing this in Latin America. Operation Condor is a great example. Just another example of what Lenin's laying out theoretically here. Private capital crushes any kind of new proletarian democracy, and it's the job of that proletarian democracy to suppress private capital efficiently and defend itself if they really want to create a new economic system and a new system that doesn't have all the evils and the contradictions of capitalism that's run by the workers. So the suppression of the bourgeoisie is different from the suppression of the proletariat, because it's the suppression right now is by the minority, by these stockholders and members of the military-industrial complex, not by people like you and me, to suppress the masses who work. And a proletarian democracy is a suppression of this minority of people who's been running stuff and murdering everyone for so long, and we're suppressing them and replacing it with a non-imperialistic, non-violent, non-profiting off putting black people in jail system. We're going to replace it with something much, much better. And once the bourgeoisie has been suppressed, the state no longer has a function and can wither away. And the phenomenon that Lenin didn't see and Marx didn't see when they were writing this was how capitalism is a global phenomenon. So every time a country has a revolution, generally Europe or the US is going to come in with the CIA and with all the tools they have and try and crush it. And so the Soviet Union had to develop this bureaucracy, and 30% of their funding was going into military because they were invaded 7 times after they had a proletarian revolution. And a lot of people don't know that because that's not taught in the US. But, yeah. So, let me find where I'm at. So once the bourgeoisie is suppressed, the state can win their way, blah, 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 blah. Oh, and I was just going to say, there's all these different institutions to protect global capitalism now that have made capitalism global. The World Bank, the UN, NATO, CIA, FBI, NSA, all these different apparatuses they have to spy on the proletariat, to suppress us, and do it on a global level, because capitalism exists globally now. So Lenin finishes this part here with a critique of Edward Bernstein, who Lenin thinks is naive and hopes to return to primitive... Edward Bernstein, on the other hand, says Marx and Lenin are naive and they hope to return to primitive democracy with tribes and bodies of armed men who serve the masses of society. And I think this is basically saying, like, oh, no, you workers are too dumb to govern yourselves. You're just going to be like tribes. You need smart people like me, Edward Bernstein, to decide what actually happened. So Lenin says it's not at all the same as going back to tribal democracy, what him and Marx are proposing. Capitalism has already developed large-scale industry, and we need only to continue running these functions, only without the stockholders and capitalists who are actually useless to production but are collecting all the profits, right? So capitalism's already developed these ways to produce things, and now it's a little different because we have the climate crisis. We have to change how we're producing things in certain ways, but it's developed all these institutions for production, meaning basically industry and agriculture, and all we need to do is continue running these functions, but get rid of the stockholders, get rid of the giant corporate farms who are taking over all of agriculture in America, get rid of these finance capitalists who are sending people to die in war, the Koch brothers, these giant bankers like Goldman and Sachs who provide no actual labor, who aren't useful to the production process but are collecting all this money, and continue producing just without them. They've already created these bodies for us, these workplaces for us, or these productive functions for us. We only need to take control of them with the workers and then change them however we need to change them in order to make them beneficial to the workers. So the state can serve as a function for central planning and managing industry, but it will no longer be needed for suppression of a class, right? So you can have the state to make sure everything keeps functioning, basically an administrative function, but you no longer need them going over and doing wars to suppress the proletariat. Basically, you no longer need cops rolling around everywhere you see, giving you fines so they make sure they're collecting enough money, and throwing people in jail for nonviolent offenses to make sure that prison labor is being exploited and telecom companies are making $10 off of prisoners making phone calls. I mean, yeah. So dictatorship of the proletariat, Lenin says, is a bridge from capitalism to socialism, moving the ownership of the means of production to the workers. And only the workers can truly transform society. Bourgeois revolutions can't do it because the masses, as we said before, are the only people with the economic motivation to completely transform society to something new, to make this qualitative shift from capitalism to socialism, from bourgeois democracy, which isn't democracy at all, to workers' democracy, a true democracy. All right, so that's the first 2 parts. I'll be back later with parts 3, 4, and 5. I hope you guys are enjoying this. As I say always, you can be reading along if you want, but also I try and touch on most of the important things. Read the book for yourself if you want the full argument, because there are small things I leave out. But I'm not only trying to provide analysis and update it for modern day, but also just explain what's going on for people who don't like reading these books or have ADD or dyslexia or whatever. So I hope this is helping. Let me know in the comments if there's any way that I can improve. Suggestions are very welcome, and I've been trying to respond to as many comments as possible too. So if you have questions, let me know down there. All right, thank you everyone. This has been State and Revolution, Chapter 3, Parts 1 and 2.